The greatest battles you will ever face are not the ones that people can see, not the ones that receive praise or attention, and not the ones that happen in the open. The greatest battles are the ones that happen inside your own mind, the ones that no one else knows about, the ones that you often fight in silence. These internal battles shape you more than any external challenge ever could. When you wake up in the morning and feel a weight on your chest that you cannot explain, when your mind begins to drift into places you know you should not go, when your thoughts become louder than your voice, that is where the real war begins. The mind is the center of every victory and every defeat. Before any action is taken in the physical world, it is first taken in the mental world. Before any wrong choice is made outwardly, it is justified inwardly. Every downfall begins with an internal permission slip you sign inside your head, often unknowingly. This is why the battle begins long before the action ever appears. It begins with the whisper that says, "It's okay," even when you know it isn't. It begins with the small compromises you allow because you think they don't matter. It begins with the moments when you ignore the discomfort in your conscience, convincing yourself that it's just a feeling and not a warning. But every time you ignore that internal alarm, you silence the part of you that is trying to protect your integrity. There is a conflict between who you are and who you know you can become. Every time you feel yourself pulled between these two versions of yourself, it is a sign that a battle is happening inside you. You may not see it, but you feel it. You feel it in the tension that grows when you're about to make a decision. You feel it in the heaviness that comes after doing something you know you didn't truly want to do. You feel it in the guilt that doesn't leave you immediately. The guilt that isn't there to punish you, but to remind you that you're drifting away from your true path. This internal conflict is not a sign of weakness. It is proof that you still care about your values. It is proof that morality is still alive inside you, trying to pull you back to your center. The stronger the pull, the greater the potential inside you. Immorality does not pull those who have already surrendered. It pulls those who still have something worth protecting. That means the intensity you feel is not your enemy, it is your compass guiding you back. You cannot fight an external temptation until you first win the internal conversation. The real danger isn't the world around you. It's the voice within you that tries to negotiate with your standards. It says things like, "Just this once, nobody will know, it doesn't matter, everyone does it, and what's the big deal?" These thoughts may seem harmless at first, but they are powerful because they work in silence. They work behind the scenes, reshaping the boundaries you once held firmly. That is where most people lose the battle, not because they are weak, but because they are unaware of how powerful their internal dialogue is. Your thoughts become your decisions become your habits become your character. And once your character changes, everything else follows. This is why mastering your inner world is the first and most important step in winning the battle against immorality. You must become conscious of the conversations happening inside you. You must observe them before you obey them. When a thought enters your mind that goes against your integrity, you must recognize it for what it is, a test of your inner strength. The thought itself is not the threat. The belief in that thought is. When you allow your mind to entertain something repeatedly, it eventually becomes normal, and what becomes normal becomes acceptable. This is how immorality takes root, not through one big mistake, but through many small permissions. It always starts in the mind, and it always grows in silence. But the beauty of the internal battle is that you can reverse it at any moment. You don't need an audience, a stage, or a dramatic turning point. You just need awareness. You just need that moment when you say, "I know what this is, and I know who I am." And the moment you take back control of your thoughts, you take back control of your life. Immorality does not suddenly appear in a person's life. It grows slowly, silently, and steadily in the places where discipline has faded away. When discipline begins to weaken, it creates empty spaces, and those spaces never remain empty for long. Something always fills them. If you do not intentionally fill your life with structure, principles, and boundaries, something else will move in, something easier, something more tempting, something more comfortable, something that requires no effort but demands a high price later. Discipline is like the walls of a fortress. When those walls are strong, they protect you from impulses, temptations, and destructive habits. But when the walls crack even slightly, everything you once thought you could resist begins to feel harmless, acceptable, even normal. That is how immorality grows, not by overpowering you, but by quietly taking advantage of the spaces where your discipline is missing. When a person stops holding themselves accountable, their standards begin to sink slowly. They don't even notice it at first. You convince yourself that skipping one responsibility isn't a big deal. You convince yourself that breaking one rule won't matter. You convince yourself that ignoring one moral principle will not change anything. But that one time becomes another, and then another, until it becomes a habit. A habit becomes a lifestyle, and a lifestyle becomes an identity. This entire transformation happens because the foundation of discipline slowly eroded over time. People often complain that their lives have changed for the worse, but they rarely realize that the change started the day they allowed their discipline to weaken. The moment you stop training your mind, your impulses begin training you. The moment you stop directing your life intentionally, your desires begin directing it for you. Discipline is not just about rules. It is about self-governance. It is the ability to command yourself, to lead yourself, to hold yourself to a standard even when no one is watching. When your discipline is strong, you do not need external pressure to stay on track. But when discipline disappears, your environment takes control, your moods take control, your urges take control, and your temptations take control. Without discipline, you become reactive instead of proactive. You start responding to life instead of directing it. You allow every emotion to become an instruction, every desire to become a demand, every temptation to become a decision. That is how immorality grows, not because you are evil, but because you are undisciplined. A lack of discipline opens the door to mental chaos. When your mind lacks structure, your thoughts wander into places that weaken your integrity. Without discipline, your emotions become louder than your logic. Your desires overshadow your values. You begin to chase whatever feels good in the moment, forgetting everything that matters in the long run. Discipline is the ability to choose now what will benefit you later. Immorality is the choice to indulge now and suffer later. The two cannot coexist because they come from opposite mindsets. Discipline looks ahead, immorality looks around. Discipline seeks purpose, immorality seeks pleasure. Discipline strengthens you, immorality drains you. Every time you choose discipline, you reinforce your character. Every time you neglect discipline, you weaken your defenses. The absence of discipline creates an illusion of freedom. You feel free when you do whatever you want, without limits, without boundaries, without restraint. But that freedom is temporary and deceptive. It leads to consequences that eventually control you. What starts as a choice becomes a chain. What begins as enjoyment becomes enslavement. This is why discipline is not your enemy, it is your protector. It protects you from the versions of yourself that might destroy your future. It protects you from temporary desires that can create permanent damage. Without discipline, even the strongest person becomes vulnerable. Without discipline, even the wisest person becomes weak. Without discipline, even the most moral person begins to drift into behavior they once believed they would never accept. You cannot win the battle against immorality if you do not rebuild your discipline. Discipline is the foundation of morality. It is the structure that your values stand on. It is the strength that supports your principles. Every time you choose to be consistent, even when it is difficult, you reinforce your ability to resist what is wrong. Every time you follow through on a commitment, even when you feel unmotivated, you sharpen your sense of integrity. Every time you deny a destructive impulse, you strengthen your inner power. Discipline is built one decision at a time. And every disciplined decision you make becomes another brick in the wall that protects your mind, your character, and your future. Immorality only grows when it has room to grow. And the room it needs is created by the absence of discipline. The more disciplined you become, the less space immorality has to influence your life. When your discipline is sharp, your decisions are clearer, your boundaries are stronger, and your actions are aligned with your values. You gain control over your thoughts, your emotions, and your behavior. You begin to feel a sense of inner authority, a sense of inner strength, a sense of inner clarity. And as your discipline strengthens, immorality weakens automatically because it cannot survive in a life that is intentionally structured, internally governed, and protected by strong personal boundaries. The environment in which you live, work, and think has far more influence over your moral compass than most people realize. You are constantly absorbing, consciously or unconsciously, the attitudes, values, and behaviors of the people around you. Your environment is not just physical, it is mental, emotional, and spiritual. It is composed of the media you consume, the conversations you engage in, the ideas you entertain, and the people you allow to occupy your time and attention. Every moment spent in an environment that condones, celebrates, or normalizes immoral behavior chips away at your own ability to discern right from wrong. Just as a plant grows according to the soil, water, and sunlight it receives, your character develops according to the influences that surround you. If the soil is toxic, No amount of internal strength alone can ensure healthy growth. You cannot expect to cultivate virtue in an environment that is constantly feeding you impulses, justifications, and pressures to compromise. The first step in winning the battle against immorality is recognizing that where you stand daily has a direct effect on who you become over time. When you surround yourself with people whose values are weak or whose actions are driven by convenience and desire rather than principle, you begin to mirror them without even realizing it. Humans are social creatures. We are wired to adapt and conform. If the majority of your peers accept small compromises as normal, you will eventually begin to accept them as normal too. If your workplace, your social circle, or your community frequently blurs the line between right and wrong, your own line begins to blur. Immorality thrives in environments that normalize unethical behavior, whether that behavior is dishonesty, laziness, gossip, or indulgence. The danger is that it often starts subtly. At first, you might rationalize certain actions, telling yourself that everyone else is doing it or that it is not significant enough to worry about. Over time, these small concessions accumulate, forming a pattern that seems natural and unresistible. If you want to fight immorality effectively, you must first understand that your environment is either a breeding ground for weakness or a training ground for strength, and the difference lies in conscious selection. Your mind is particularly sensitive to repeated exposure. What you see, hear, and experience repeatedly shapes your expectations, your beliefs, and ultimately your behavior. If you spend hours consuming content that glorifies indulgence, deception, or shortcuts to success, your mind begins to normalize those ideas. The messages you internalize through music, movies, social media, or casual conversations slowly rewire your perception of what is acceptable. Every day you are influenced, and over time, influence solidifies into habits, and habits harden into character. That is why people who are committed to living moral, principled lives are deliberate about their environments. They carefully choose who they spend time with, what they watch, what they read, and what conversations they participate in. They do not leave these decisions to chance because they understand that small, seemingly insignificant influences compound over time, producing outcomes that are either aligned with their values or in direct opposition to them. It is not enough to avoid the obvious sources of corruption. You must actively cultivate an environment that reinforces your integrity. This means surrounding yourself with people whose actions, words, and priorities reflect the principles you want to embody. It means consuming content that uplifts, challenges, and strengthens your mind rather than dulls it. It means spending your time in places that encourage growth, reflection, and accountability. You cannot fight the subtle creep of immorality if you consistently expose yourself to it, no matter how strong your initial intentions are. Even the strongest character can erode when constantly exposed to permissive environments, because immorality is not just an external force, it is an internal response to external input. The stronger the input, the stronger the internal temptation. The more permissive the surroundings, the more normalized the impulses become, and the harder it is to resist. Your environment also influences your mental focus. If you are surrounded by discipline and moral alignment, resisting temptation becomes more natural. Your mind does not have to fight alone. It receives reinforcement from the surroundings, which act as silent allies in the battle to preserve integrity. The most powerful aspect of your environment is that it does not only influence your behavior, it also influences your beliefs about yourself. When you consistently see people acting with courage, honesty, and integrity, you begin to believe that you too can embody those traits. When your surroundings reflect moral strength, it shapes your self-expectations and encourages you to live up to a higher standard. On the other hand, when your environment tolerates dishonesty, indulgence, or shortcuts, it subtly lowers your expectations of yourself and convinces you that compromise is inevitable. That is why changing your environment is not merely a tactical choice, it is a strategic necessity. The people, places, and information you allow into your life become mirrors for who you will be tomorrow, and the battle against immorality cannot be won if those mirrors are reflecting weakness rather than strength. Immorality thrives in silence because what we fail to address, we inadvertently allow to grow. The human mind is wired to accept patterns, and repetition without opposition becomes the blueprint for normal behavior. When you see wrongdoing and choose not to respond, when you witness compromise and say nothing, when you feel the stirrings of conscience but remain passive, you are participating in the problem whether you realize it or not. Silence is not neutral. It is consent in disguise, a quiet approval that slowly erodes your moral boundaries. People often think that by staying silent they are avoiding conflict or maintaining peace, but what they fail to recognize is that silence allows the seeds of immorality to take root and grow unchecked. Every time you fail to speak up, every time you fail to correct a small wrong, every time you fail to confront a distortion of truth, you are teaching yourself and others that these things are acceptable. Immorality does not need a loud proclamation to survive. It only needs a space in which no one objects, a space in which no one enforces standards, a space in which it can grow unnoticed. Silence allows rationalization to take over. When you fail to confront wrong, your mind begins to justify your inaction. You tell yourself, it's not my responsibility, or I don't want to make waves, or it's not serious enough to matter. These thoughts feel comforting in the moment, but they are dangerous because they shift your internal compass just slightly. And over time, that slight shift becomes a permanent bend in your sense of right and wrong. Immorality grows gradually, and it grows strongest in minds that are quiet when they should speak, that turn away when they should confront, that accept compromise when they should stand firm. The quiet moments of inaction are where the battle is truly lost, not necessarily in the dramatic acts that eventually result from it. The person who tolerates a little dishonesty, a little deceit, or a little indulgence begins to normalize these behaviors within themselves, and eventually their entire moral framework shifts. They become desensitized to actions they once knew were wrong, and because they never confronted them, they convince themselves that it is natural to compromise, to avoid responsibility, and to overlook transgressions. Confrontation is not always about fighting with others. It is often about fighting with yourself. Immorality thrives when you ignore the internal alarms your conscience raises. Every time you feel that twinge of discomfort, that quiet sense of something being wrong, and you ignore it, you are allowing the immoral influence to grow stronger inside you. The longer you tolerate those internal warnings without action, the weaker your ethical framework becomes. Silence is dangerous because it allows moral corrosion to happen slowly, almost imperceptibly. You may not notice the gradual changes in your thinking, in your attitudes, and in your willingness to compromise until they are so ingrained that they feel like who you are. What starts as a single act of avoidance or inaction multiplies into patterns, habits, and ultimately character traits. Immorality does not announce itself, it slips in quietly, and silence is its most effective ally. Another reason immorality flourishes in silence is that it allows social conformity to dictate behavior. When no one speaks up against wrongdoing, it signals to others that such behavior is acceptable, even if it is contrary to their own values. Communities, workplaces, and social groups all have unspoken rules shaped by collective silence. When you do not correct a small ethical violation, you are participating in the normalization of that violation. Others see your inaction as tacit approval and adjust their behavior accordingly. The moral standards of the group begin to shift downward, not because anyone explicitly decreed it, but because silence allowed it to happen. Immorality thrives when it encounters no resistance, and resistance cannot exist if everyone chooses quiet compliance. This is why silence is so dangerous. It not only affects you internally, but also has a ripple effect on the people around you. Each act of non-confrontation becomes part of a larger pattern that slowly redefines what is acceptable, what is tolerable, and what is permissible. Silence also prevents accountability, both externally and internally. Without voice, there is no challenge to wrong actions. Without challenge, the wrong actions are reinforced. When you fail to speak up, to question, to correct, or to confront, you remove the possibility of accountability, and with accountability removed, immorality grows unchecked. Accountability is a powerful force because it demands reflection, correction, and consequence. Silence removes that force entirely. You cannot rely on the hope that someone else will intervene. Inaction allows moral decay to continue, and over time, the decay spreads until it becomes systemic. The person who consistently chooses silence instead of confrontation begins to experience a weakening of their moral courage. Their ability to act rightly diminishes because they have allowed themselves to practice inaction repeatedly. The absence of confrontation, the tolerance of small wrongs, and the failure to correct misbehavior combine to create an environment in which immorality not only survives but thrives. Immorality grows strongest not when opposed but when unnoticed, ignored, and tolerated. The individual who refuses to acknowledge wrongdoing, both in themselves and others, becomes a silent participant in its spread. The internal struggle to act rightly is lost in the quiet moments of avoidance. The person who fails to speak up against small corruptions slowly loses the ability to discern right from wrong with clarity. Silence is not absence. It is active participation in the wrong it avoids addressing. Every tolerated misdeed, every overlooked injustice, every ignored conscience call allows immorality to root deeper, to entrench itself more firmly, and to spread more widely, and it thrives most when there is no voice to challenge it. Integrity is not a one-time decision. It is a continuous process, a series of choices made moment by moment, day by day, that define the trajectory of your life. It is not something you achieve once and then carry effortlessly. It is something you cultivate and protect through consistent action, vigilance, and awareness. Every decision, no matter how small, contributes to the building of your character, and the accumulation of these decisions ultimately shapes the person you become. People often mistake integrity for a dramatic act, a public demonstration of honesty or virtue, but the truth is that integrity is forged in the ordinary moments when no one is watching, when the choices you make are invisible to the world yet decisive for your own development. It is in the moments when you resist temptation, speak the truth, honor your commitments, and uphold your values, even when it is inconvenient or uncomfortable, that integrity grows. Each small decision to remain faithful to your principles strengthens the foundation of your character, creating a life that is resilient against the forces of immorality. Integrity is maintained through awareness. It requires you to be conscious of your thoughts, words, and actions at all times. Immorality often finds entry into a life that is distracted, careless, or inattentive. It begins with small compromises, subtle justifications, and quiet rationalizations that seem harmless in isolation, but gradually shift the boundaries of acceptable behavior. When you are aware of these tendencies, when you recognize the slippery slope of compromise, you can intervene before minor lapses become entrenched patterns. Integrity is about choosing to act according to your values consistently, even when it conflicts with convenience, comfort, or immediate gratification. It is about understanding that every decision has a ripple effect on your character, and that the smallest compromises, if repeated, can erode the foundation of your moral framework. This awareness is the first step in ensuring that your actions are aligned with your principles and that you are not unconsciously allowing immorality to take root. Every choice to act with integrity is a choice to empower yourself. Immorality thrives where discipline, responsibility, and accountability are weak. When you consistently act with integrity, you build an internal authority that guides your decisions and reinforces your sense of self-respect. This internal authority becomes a compass helping you navigate complex situations, resist peer pressure, and maintain clarity in moments of temptation. Acting with integrity is not always easy. It often requires courage, patience, and persistence. There will be times when the easier path tempts you, when shortcuts present themselves, when bending a principle seems convenient. The difference between those who maintain moral strength and those who falter is not the absence of temptation, but the consistent choice to honor their values despite it. Each decision to stay true to yourself strengthens your ability to resist the next temptation, creating a positive cycle of moral fortitude. Integrity also demands consistency. It is not enough to act rightly in some areas of life while neglecting others. True integrity permeates every aspect of your being, your thoughts, your speech, your behavior, your relationships, and your commitments. It is holistic. You cannot claim to have integrity in your professional life while routinely compromising in your personal relationships or your private thoughts. Morality and character are woven into the fabric of your entire life, and neglecting any part of it weakens the whole. Maintaining integrity requires vigilance across all dimensions of your life, a continuous effort to ensure that your actions are congruent with your values. When you consistently align your behavior with your principles, you create a coherent identity, a life in which your actions and values reinforce each other, making immorality increasingly difficult to infiltrate. The cultivation of integrity is also an act of self-respect. Every time you honor your commitments, speak the truth, and uphold your principles, you reinforce your own sense of worth. Conversely, every act of compromise, deception, or indulgence that goes against your values erodes that sense of self-respect, often in ways that are subtle and cumulative. Maintaining integrity is not just about external appearances, it is about the internal state of your being. It is about the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that, regardless of circumstances, you are living in alignment with your deepest values. This internal alignment creates a resilience against moral challenges, a strength that is not dependent on external validation or reward. Integrity also serves as a guide in moments of uncertainty. Life is full of situations where the right path is not obvious, where pressures and incentives encourage compromise, and where immediate benefits conflict with long-term consequences. It is in these moments that integrity becomes crucial. By cultivating a habit of consistent moral alignment, you develop a clear internal framework for decision-making. Your values become a lens through which all options are evaluated, and this clarity prevents confusion, hesitation, and moral drift. The more consistently you act with integrity, the more automatic these decisions become, reducing the likelihood of succumbing to immorality even when circumstances are challenging. Ultimately, integrity is a practice of vigilance, self-discipline, and alignment with your higher self. It is reinforced by conscious choices repeated consistently over time, and it grows stronger the more it is exercised. Each decision to remain true to your principles strengthens your moral capacity, fortifies your character, and makes you increasingly resilient against the creeping influence of immorality. It is through these deliberate, consistent choices that the battle against immorality is won, because integrity is not a state to be achieved once, but a continual journey of becoming, a lifelong process of honoring your principles in every thought, word, and action, a persistent commitment to live in alignment with the highest version of yourself. Winning the battle against immorality begins with elevating your mind, because your thoughts are the architects of your life. Every action you take, every decision you make, every habit you form is born from what first exists in your mind. If your thoughts are clouded with compromise, justification, or indulgence, your actions will inevitably reflect that. But when your mind rises to clarity, purpose, and principle, your life aligns naturally with integrity and moral strength. Elevating the mind is not simply thinking positively or visualizing success. It is intentionally choosing the quality of your thoughts, the focus of your attention, and the depth of your understanding about what is right and wrong. The mind is the battlefield where morality and immorality first clash. Immorality does not usually strike with force. It enters subtly through distraction, rationalization, desire, and repeated exposure to lower standards of thought. A mind that is passive or undisciplined becomes fertile ground for compromise, because thoughts that are entertained quietly take root and influence decisions long before you recognize the danger. That is why the elevation of the mind is the first and most critical step in defending against immoral influence. When you elevate your mind, you are not only controlling what you think about, but also how you think. You begin to recognize the patterns of compromise, the ways in which small concessions creep into decisions over time, and the subtle rationalizations that attempt to justify what you know is wrong. Immorality thrives when thought is uncontrolled, when reasoning is lazy, and when reflection is absent. By actively raising the quality of your thinking, by challenging assumptions, questioning impulses, and aligning your thoughts with principle, you create a mental environment in which immorality struggles to survive. Elevated thought is disciplined thought. It is intentional thought. It is focused on long-term outcomes rather than short-term gratification, clarity rather than convenience, and truth rather than deception. The more consistently you cultivate elevated thinking, the less power immorality has to influence your actions, because every action is filtered through the lens of a mind trained to discern right from wrong. Elevating the mind also strengthens your ability to resist temptation. Temptation rarely confronts you with the full weight of its consequences. It seduces you with appearances, conveniences, and short-term pleasure. A mind that is not elevated is easily swayed by surface impressions, fleeting desires, and external pressures. But when the mind is elevated, it sees beyond the immediate, weighs the long-term effects, and recognizes the hidden costs of compromise. The elevated mind anticipates consequences before actions are taken. It measures the impact of small concessions, evaluates the trajectory of repeated behaviors, and understands the subtle ways in which compromise weakens character. By training your mind to think with clarity and foresight, you create a natural resistance to immorality, because your thoughts are aligned with principle before action is even considered. Another critical aspect of elevating the mind is the cultivation of awareness. Awareness allows you to see the influences around you, to identify the patterns of immorality, and to recognize when you are being led away from your values. Immorality often succeeds in stealth, taking advantage of distraction, complacency, or ignorance. When your mind is elevated, you are no longer passive in your experiences. You become active observers of your thoughts, surroundings, and actions. You notice when subtle rationalizations arise, when your environment begins to normalize compromise, and when your emotions attempt to override reason. This heightened awareness is the foundation of moral vigilance, because it equips you to respond to immorality before it takes hold. The elevated mind sees clearly what the undisciplined mind overlooks, giving you a strategic advantage in the battle for integrity. Elevating the mind also transforms your values into actions naturally. When your thoughts rise to higher standards, your actions follow suit without the need for force or struggle. Immorality is powerful because it exploits disconnection between thought and behavior. When your mind is preoccupied with lower priorities, distractions, or indulgences, your actions drift accordingly. But as your mental focus aligns with clarity, purpose, and principle, your decisions, habits, and daily choices begin to reflect that elevation effortlessly. You no longer have to fight every temptation. Your elevated thinking makes certain choices obvious, natural, and automatic. The mind becomes the pilot, and your life follows the course it charts, making integrity not just a goal, but a natural state of being. Furthermore, an elevated mind strengthens your resilience in the face of external pressures. Immorality often appears in social influence, cultural trends, and the expectations of others. A mind that is passive or untrained is easily swayed by peer pressure, popular opinion, and immediate gratification. But an elevated mind maintains a clear internal compass. It evaluates external input critically, accepts what aligns with principle, and rejects what undermines it. By raising your thoughts, you create mental armor that allows you to interact with the world without being corrupted by it. Your environment may present temptations, distractions, and challenges, but your mind operates from a higher vantage point, choosing responses that protect and reinforce your integrity. Finally, elevating your mind creates a compounding effect over time. Every elevated thought strengthens future decision-making, sharpens discernment, and fortifies character. Each conscious effort to think with clarity, purpose, and principle builds momentum that makes resisting immorality increasingly natural and effortless. As your mental standards rise, your life follows, because thought is the seed from which action grows, habit solidifies, and character is built. Immorality cannot survive in a mind that has been trained, disciplined, and elevated, because such a mind perceives compromise as weakness, indulgence as danger, and principle as non-negotiable, creating a life in which moral integrity becomes the default operating state rather than an occasional choice.